Welcome to People with Purpose. I am your host, Sylvain Rochon. I'm a speaker, an author, a serial entrepreneur, and a business strategist. My purpose is to engineer a paradise on Earth using cutting-edge technology. I hope this show will give you excellent examples of individuals that chose to do great things in their personal and professional lives. Perhaps they will inspire you to follow in their footsteps. The show's format is very simple. I ask my guests 3 simple questions. What is your personal purpose? Why is it important to you? And how did you get started? Now let's hear from our guest.
Okay.
Hello, everybody. Well, you know who I am. This is the People with Purpose, Sylvain Rochon, your host, and I am today with you, and I'm bringing in Austen Allred, who's come to my radar a few months ago, just reading Twitter, I say. And I thought it was really sharp tweets, nothing in particular. And then I kind of checked out what he did, like his business. And he's the CEO of Lambda School. If you haven't heard about it, you have to check it out. It's the tagline for the school is a revolutionary new school that invests in you. And the business model is exactly that. That's why I thought it was so interesting. They make no money. There's no tuition to go to school. It's an online school, in particular for programming. So, programmers, engineers, things like that. And you only pay if you make over $50,000 a year, and only for the first 2 years. So actually, they really invest in you first, and they can pay later, which is completely upside down from traditional, post-secondary school and or any professional school. So I figured I gotta talk to this guy, and we have to bring him into the People of Purpose. And here he is. Hello, Austen.
Hello. Thanks for having me.
You're welcome. Now, this show is not necessarily about Lambda School, although you may bring us there if you want. We are interested in a single answer, which is often complicated. But you don't need to be an engineer to answer the question. It's all right.
All right.
The question is, what is your life purpose, in your opinion?
Man, that is both a really good question and a really difficult one to answer. So I have, throughout my life, I have paid attention to inefficiencies in markets a lot. Mm-hmm. And a lot of my thinking is just based on where I think things are priced lower than they should be, which seems like a not very important thing, but I think at scale and with the right angle, it's actually incredibly important, specifically where an equilibrium is off and where there's more value than price and stuff like that. Anyway, mm-hmm. From an economic standpoint, but I think what really gets me up in the morning is increasing the economic value of human capital. And I know that's a mouthful, but basically I think that people are underutilized just because they're not given access to the tools they need to have this, valuable skill sets. And right. Is our mission to solve that. So in my perfect world, every person would be at the height of their potential from an economic and personal standpoint. And I think we can make that happen to some degree.
Can you give me an example of a situation where individuals are underutilized or undervalued that you currently see?
Yeah, I'll give you quite a few. One really obvious one. So I grew up in a small town, and I was living in the small town right before I moved to San Francisco to work in tech. So I was living kind of by my in-laws' farm. My wife's family are farmers for generations. And there are some really sharp, intelligent people from that area of the world that don't make very much money just because they deal with what they have. You work with the circumstances that you were born into.
Sure.
So for a lot of them, education, generally speaking, is out of reach. For most of them, skill-based, or, call it the knowledge economy, if you want to, is out of reach. And then I would go to San Francisco, which has the complete opposite problem. So I like to tell the story that, there's some really smart people back in that town that are making, call it $20,000 a year, which you can make it on that in small towns. But then I'd go to San Francisco and they would say, hey, if you can bring an engineer, we'll give you a $10,000 hiring bonus. And it struck me that, a hiring bonus in San Francisco is a salary in Utah,
right?
Rural areas. And so I'd go talk to people in that rural area and say, if you gain these skills, maybe it would cost you $10,000, but you could triple your income. You could quadruple your income. You could maybe 10x your income. But because there's that upfront cost requirement, it's just not possible. So my mission is how can I find all of the really smart people that are in a certain scenario for usually circumstantial reasons and help them get to where they could be.
So it's like lowering the bar for a better education that can get you significant salaries in a way, like by essentially making it free or extremely affordable.
Yeah. So our main mission is to eliminate the barriers to an education that will make you worth more in the job market.
Yeah.
And everybody recognizes that's there, but right now the way that we try to make that happen is we say, hey, go to college, take out $100,000 in student loans, and hope that it works out on the other side.
Yeah, that's a rough patch.
It's a brutal proposition to make, especially if you've never made more than $20,000 a year. The thought of spending even $10,000 a year on tuition with no assurance as to whether or not it works out is scary. But on the other hand, if it does work out, then the economic value to you over your lifetime is enormous, right? So we have a ton of examples of students at Lambda School that move from $30,000 a year to $85,000 a year. So that's $50,000 a year, and over the course of their lifetimes, that's literally millions of dollars in swing in income. And we can do that for relatively little money, So why isn't everybody jumping in line to go to school? It's just because there's too much personal risk, and we want to alleviate that.
Well, that's a goal for Lambda, of course, and I totally get it. I don't know if you researched me a little bit, but I'm writing about. I'm a futurist, right? So I write about ideal futures, and since I'm an educator, I do have strong feelings about how education is structured. Which is probably why I was so impressed with Lambda School and the underlying concept. So that's great. I mean, that's giving the opportunities for the skilled individuals that may not be able to otherwise attend school to reach goals. Now you're giving them the opportunity to do that. So you feel that this type of process or system or company or offering is part of your purpose in society. This is something that really gets you out of bed and gets you moving, correct?
Yeah, absolutely.
And why do you think this is so important to you? Because I mean, how does it benefit you at all?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely believe that a rising tide lifts all boats. So some more background that may be related to that is that I spent a couple of years in the former Soviet Union. I lived in China for a while, and just looking at the drastic differences was shocking. When I was in Ukraine, I would live on $2,000 a year, and that was a solid. You could do that, and everything had to be very cheap so that people could survive, but it was just such a different lifestyle, right? It's so hard to even have the basic stuff that we have in the US that we all take for granted, that you don't realize that you take for granted until you try to live without it. And so I think just seeing that discrepancy and knowing, this person is killing themselves in the mines out in Gorlovka, and if they were working at McDonald's in the US, they would have a better life. And
That's kind of funny, think about it.
Whereas in the US, we're like, oh, McDonald's, that doesn't really pay a living wage. We need to do something about that. It's just that contrast has always really struck me. And I also fundamentally believe that life isn't zero sum. So helping people make more money doesn't cause other people to make less money. And not even just from a money perspective, from just a quality of life perspective. I think that's the most obvious way that I can try to help people live on a higher plane of life to some degree.
So it seems to me like throughout all these beautiful ideas, you haven't really talked about yourself. So, I mean, what you get out of it in any tangible way. So am I to assume that this is a passion? You don't really, I mean, of course you derive, I'm pretty sure your companies are making income for you and things like that, and you're taking care of yourself here. But it seems to me like your main focus is others. It's just, improvements in society, improvements in the economy, kind of rectifying oddities and wrongs, perhaps, in some way. Am I making sense? Yeah,
definitely. That's funny that you mentioned that, because I hadn't even thought about that. In my mind, it's all the same. Because Lambda School, our model is basically, let's create huge amounts of value for other people, and then we'll take a slice of it, sure. And that's, what we require for sustainability and, all that stuff. I mean, I'm in a situation now where I spend a lot of time with billionaires and people who have wealth that I, still can't even fathom. But after a certain point, it all just doesn't matter. And I think that's one of the things that I also learned in, Ukraine and China, is that, having a living is really important, and being able to provide for yourself is very important. But the difference in happiness level going from low income to high isn't huge. Well, at a certain point, there's diminishing returns, right?
Yeah.
So if you have $50 million, that's really not very different from having $100 million. So I realize I'm talking about like economic theory again, and not myself, which is what you asked about.
No, it's okay.
But I guess from my perspective, if I've always just thought, if I have the basics down and then I can just have fun and try to shake things up all day, try to make a difference, then that's all I could ever ask for.
So fundamentally, you do it because you enjoy doing these things.
Oh yeah, I mean, Warren Buffett says he tap dances to work every day. I absolutely feel the same way. I can't wait to get up in the morning and go to work and go to talk to the students.
That's awesome. That's awesome. And here's another question. Like you mentioned that you traveled a lot, like in was it Ukraine, China? You've lived there. I'm imagining you were an adult at that point, assuming. Mm-hmm. Now, where do you think this kind of direction or this kind of motivation comes from? Like, this desire to balance economies or cost of, fight the cost of living, or the current systems, the status quo in education. Like, if you think as far as you can back in your past, like where do you think the kernel of that actually came from?
Yeah, so I think I kind of have a reductionist viewpoint. So I think that came from, basically I read a lot of Thoreau, and that kind of thing, and I got really into minimalism and simplicity, and like what are the actual essentials that you need to be happy, and how much of our time do we spend trading our labor for money that will then, turn around and spend on stuff that won't actually make a difference for us. And I think the combination of living in Ukraine and thinking that way really shaped a lot of who I am. So when I was in China, I had a tiny backpack and that was it. And I realized, I could either be working at an investment bank, making huge amounts of money, trying to afford a Manhattan apartment, or I could go throw it a little bit and go live with, less income, but less demands on your time, I guess. But then from the counter to that I think isn't considered enough, in my opinion, is that Thoreau had to work really, really hard to have not very much. So sure, he freed himself from the shackles of society. He could go live out in the wild, but his life wasn't necessarily more fulfilling that way. He just spent all of his time trying to get food. And I'm not convinced that that's optimal either. So, really the ideal, if you can find a way to, and that comes back to, Thoreau didn't have trade and he didn't have a market and he didn't have, he had to do everything all by himself. Whereas I can go down to McDonald's and get a chicken sandwich for $1, which is like, call that, 5 minutes of my time I've paid for a chicken sandwich. If Thoreau wanted to have a chicken sandwich, he'd spend years trying to do everything that he would need to have a chicken sandwich.
So not optimal.
Yeah, definitely suboptimal. So, I'm really interested in what is the optimal way to have time and enjoyment. And the funny thing is, for me, that turns into working a lot, but because I love it. And I have total fulfillment in what I spend my time doing. I don't regret a minute of it.
That's awesome. So in a nutshell, it's what in your mind kind of gave you that perspective of life, your current purpose and drive, really came about more when in your adult life, when you were younger, when you read stories from Thoreau, when you make these trips and live in other countries where the economic situation is very different. And you actually went out in the world and experienced a different way of thinking than the typical American way, right?
Definitely.
That gave you a different perspectives that you may not have had if you hadn't done that.
Yeah.
So that's pretty interesting.
Definitely. I mean, I kind of, a lot of it was, just boredom to some degree, right? Like I was going to college, I had, and maybe that, speaks to a relatively privileged upbringing. I mean, by definition, privileged because I grew up middle class in the United States.
Sure.
But I never had to worry about, will I be able to put food on the table for myself? So then it becomes, well, what is this all about? Why am I going to college? What's the point? I know I can, I know I'll be fine. So a little bit of boredom and kind of wanting to explore the fringes of things is what I think brought that about.
Well, that's fascinating. I'm sure a lot of people, we hear about a lot of our friends back in the day that went on a walkabout, or they wanted to take a sabbatical between high school and college, right?
Yeah.
Just to explore, kind of discover what's really out there. Because I mean, honestly, if you're up until the end of high school, you don't do a whole lot except school and being at home with parents.
Yeah.
You don't really experience the world. You may read a lot, especially now with the internet. Like I'm old enough to remember when there was nothing, right?
Yeah.
Like you had the phone on the wall, and that was your connection with the world. Whoever was on the other end, and that's only when he could pick up, because if you remember when there was no answering machines. I'm not that old. Which
Yeah.
means it's like all these advancements actually are really recent,
Yeah.
right?
Happening faster and faster.
It's all exponential. So, but now, like I figure, people think, especially the young people, they still think, well, they can discover the world through the internet. Great, but it's not like living it, right? Reading about it, watching videos about it gives you information, but living through some experiences in different parts of the world really gives you different perspectives. And anybody who's fairly young, including my nephews who are teens now, you got to go out in the world to really know shit. You can't just read about it. You got to go, and then that gives you perspective. And when you come back like you did, you're on a different path than you probably would have been if you hadn't gone. And you're doing amazing things.
Well, thank you.
So that's great. A final question: if you had anything specific to say to the audience, and the audience is very wide, all ages. What would be the one thing you'd like to say to people watching this?
One thing I'd like to say to people. Read more.
Ah. Good advice for all ages. All eras too.
Yeah, I think reading is also drastically underrated. Well, maybe it's not underrated, but underutilized for sure.
Yeah, I think so. Well, that's great advice.
Yeah.
Yeah. So anyway, thanks a lot for being here. I'm so happy you could take out some time out of your busy schedule to be with me today.
Yeah, happy to do so.
Yeah. And maybe we'll have some other discussions later, maybe in a year, to talk specifically about Lambda. Why not?
Yeah, that sounds good.
All right. See ya.
I hope you enjoyed the interview. If you did, please subscribe to the channel, comment, like, and share. Please join me also on Clubify, a social app allowing us to share ideas and where you can participate in some of my projects. The link is in the section below. Also, if you wish to recommend someone great I should interview, please let me know. And as always, follow your passion. See you next week.